Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Book with Bill. My guest today is Kirsten Kaschock, author of An Impossibility of Crows. Hello, Kirsten. Welcome to the show. For those who don't know, we've known each other through a mutual acquaintance, being your husband for for a number of years. This is the first time we've had deep, serious talks, than when I came to visit you guys, about your work. So I was very excited, folks, to be chosen to receive an advance copy of An Impossibility of Crows. And I told Kirsten up front, I'm like, I'm a slow reader, so you have to send this to me months in advance because I'm I'm terribly slow as a reader. But I was really glad that I was able to get this because it hits on so many of my favorite themes. The genres, I'm going to say plurally because I think to call this a single genre book would be a misnomer. But let's talk a little bit about you and your background before we dig deeper into the book. So tell us a little bit about you as an author, as a poet. You've done a lot of different things in your life, but give us an overview.
So I call myself a poet, and first and foremost, because I think poets have a certain orientation towards perception and reality and their use of language that carries over to other types of writing. So even as I write this novel, which I love that you acknowledge that it has several genres that it's leaning on. It might be gothic horror, it's definitely literary fiction. But the orientation to language is I love reading and writing at the sentence level. Like if you fall in love with a sentence, that makes me happy, one of mine. Poet first. I've written a number of books. This is my second novel. And the first one came out over a decade ago, so it's been a while. But I'm always writing both poetry on one hand, and I'm also almost always writing some long form thing so I can stay in that world. And I love having the two of those back and forth.
So in addition to this busyness that you immerse yourself in, you also teach. And you had a stint as a Pew Scholar, right? Where you talk a little bit about that, about the teaching side of it, and interacting with young writers, young poets. Talk a little bit about that too.
It keeps you on your game. I learned so much from I'm a professor, taught at a bunch of different institutions. When I was living in Baltimore, actually, it was the first time that I worked with illustrators. So I was teaching creative writing for illustration. So people who were working with graphic novels, anime, doing game design, all sorts of things. And their way of thinking through story was, I hope that I sucked up some of that and absorbed it because it was a completely new um, way of conceptualizing story arcs, narrative flow. I love it. Those students still love the choose your own adventure because that's actually, I guess, it's related to how game design works. And so I feel like that, I think I taught there 3 years. Those three classes really reinvigorated my ideas about how story could be. I
Yeah,
loved it.
it's funny that the that's what I mean by the collaborative kind of relational part. Because to me, as a teacher as well, I'm teaching and I'm coaching, but I'm also learning from every semester
Yeah.
of class, right? And in many cases being inspired by the ways in which other people and younger people are thinking about things. Oftentimes, yeah, I don't think I'd get fired for saying this, but oftentimes I'm more inspired by my students than I am by my colleagues because specifically the subject matter, right? Like my students are doing things that I'm into, whereas a lot of my colleagues might be doing things in my department or division, but it's not exactly my jam. speaking of interactions, before we dig into the book, how how much does who you are, who you have been, impact what you're writing, whether that's poetry or novels? And I'm talking about, because you had a career in dance and body movement, all that stuff. Like I know with your first novel, you integrated part of your life, right? So how much of who you are goes into the work?
So much. It's interesting because when I was young, um, fiction was, I think the primary, like if you wanted to be a writer, you wanted to be a novelist, right?
Right.
And there was a shift in the culture where memoir became the main thing. And this idea, this dictum, write what like write from experience, which we're all raised in. I could never write straight memoir. I tried. I teach creative nonfiction. I've written a few essays, but I can't get into because I cannot tell the truth in truth. I can't do it.
Yeah, it's.
So I
I think
use,
I was gonna say I think it's harder than a lot of people realize.
oh,
It's not.
absolutely.
It is so much deeper.
And it's so much for me, it's so much easier to peel back the layers that I really want to talk about, something that's deeper, a theme that I really want to dig at. That is so much easier to me to do, not just in fiction, but specifically in fantasy and science fiction, where like I can create a world that will help me do that work.
Right.
So yeah, I write from myself. I deeply. That doesn't mean that it's recognizable. Although I love this my first novel, my really good friend, she's like, "Oh, there is such an ensemble cast of this novel." And there was like Kirsten is this person and Kirsten is this person.
Right.
But that's what we do, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of characters are facets of our personalities, and we're writing them to kind of introspectively, figure out some of those facets. All right, so let's dig into Crows. So introduce us to the main character, Agnes. Who is Agnes? Because that's a deep character, man. I mean, I'm flipping through this stuff and just the way she's figuring out herself. Speaking of introspection, right? Like it's a meta thing because I'm reading this and on some levels I'm relating to her, and then on other levels I'm like, wait a minute, no, she's not who I thought she was. This is a whole different thing. So without giving too much away, who is Agnes? Give us a background on this.
Sure. Agnes grew up on a farmstead in South Central Pennsylvania, with a, a cold father, a very strange mother, and a sister who's younger than her. She left. Her mother died when she was young. You find that out fairly early. Um, and she left for college. She became a chemist in Philadelphia, and she didn't want anything to do with that world again. Um, she creates a family, and the book starts actually 2.5 years after she has to move back to the farmstead. And she's in the process of losing or has lost so much. Her own family is falling apart, and so she's processing that. So that's where we start when everything is sort of, her job is gone, her family is in the process of falling apart, and that's how you meet her. And
Right.
you find out that there are reasons that things have not stayed together for Agnes.
Yes. And I think you perfectly kind of laid out. It's almost like we're starting out in the deep end
Mhm.
and we don't even know how to get out of the pool, let alone which way is the shallow end. And we're with Agnes as we're reading this, as she's figuring that out for herself.
Yes.
I think one of the things that hooked me, right? Because you did mention that this has some American Gothic elements to it, right? And I'm a nerd like that, so I love Robert Louis Stevenson and Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe, and all of those things were popping into my mind repeatedly as I started to get deeper into this book and deeper into what Agnes is doing. Aside from her kind of internal processing of reconciling her past with her present, and almost an existential midlife crisis, right? Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
I feel like I was connecting to that. So um,
Fantastic.
maybe I'm a little older than Agnes in the book, but I could connect with it. And it's like you get to this point in your life just after where you thought you had everything figured out, and then you're like, yeah, I don't have it all figured out, and there's a lot of baggage from the past that I have to work through. And so there's like elements of the Gothic. We'll get into that in a minute, but there's also these really deep kind of character introspections and figuring out, identity elements, right? Talk a little bit about, or maybe expand a little bit more on the relationship between her and her daughter, and why is that kind of a pivotal kind of driving element?
Sure. Agnes's daughter is disabled. She uh, has birth defects, and they don't know how mobile she'll be able to be. She's only 9 at the end of the book. So that is something that Agnes feels responsible for a number of reasons. And so we haven't mentioned in A Possibility of Crows, there is a huge crow in the book. So part of Agnes, what she does at the farm is she gets it in her head that she wants to give her daughter this gift of hypermobility, of wings, like this idea that she's going to breed a crow that her daughter can ride, because it's a kind of fantastical book. And um, but the reality that is the basis of that is this: you love your children, you want to give them everything, and then her daughter doesn't view herself as compromised in any way.
Right.
Um, so that's one of those gaps that parents and children have, right? That your parent does not necessarily see you as you see yourself. And a lot of things can go wrong in that space. And so this was definitely an exploration of that. And then, this is how I'm going to fix my child who doesn't need fixing. And and so you start from the bad premise, and it doesn't get any better from there. So,
So I just want to
mhm.
piggyback off of that, and this is intentional. I at least, and I don't know if this is my interpretation or it was intended, but I at least started to see a lot of parallels between Agnes's choices and the things that she was doing for her daughter, motivated by her own stuff. And as the story continued, seeing kind of parallels between her, her crazy mom having, kind of a similar sort of crisis in terms of trying to mold her daughters in these different, directions. And then ultimately, like how they turned out as adults. I don't want to say generational trauma, but is that is that like kind of what it is?
Absolutely. And this is I love Gothic horror. And when I was writing it, I think I felt like I was just writing horror at first, or like that was what it was in my head, like this is
Right.
a um but then I realized that there was an element of Gothic horror and Gothic literature, not even the horror, but Gothic romance and anything that you call Gothic. Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, these are popular right now. That I loved reading, Turn of the Screw, mystery, psychological, is the layers, right? And so and everything has like this causative, and it feels like an endless regression, like two mirrors facing each other. take? And how far back are you going to go? Right.
Right.
And there's not just a parallel in the her relationship with her mother, which was only revealed through she actually her relationship with her mother changes because she discovers journals from her mother. So she learns things about her mother that she never knew growing up.
Right.
So that is part of the reveal that you're getting. And then you also learn that her mother was very interested in the land of South Central Pennsylvania and what happened there, which I learned as I was writing the book. And that's also another layer of generational trauma. Like we've never dealt with what happened on, I mean, all America, yes, but this specific place, I grew up there and I had no idea how deep the trauma was in the area around my hometown.
Yeah.
And it is.
Yeah. So, man, so many things to kind of spiral off on. But before it slips from my mind, you mentioned the letters, right? One of the things that I really enjoyed about this, and I think my viewers will enjoy about this, is that you are telling this story using a lot of different tools. I mean, you really whipped out the toolbox because you have kind of your narrative fictional style, which is primarily from Agnes's perspective. She's the narrator, but you have the journals and letters, right? You have poetry that you have cleverly woven into these things. And it does reveal her mother's relationship with her daughters and with her husband. And I think it kind of engages the reader in a way that I find it hard to find a really good analogy. So I'm grasping for that, but to me it's really cool because I felt like I was getting a clearer perspective in other words, as Agnes was reading the journals, I felt as the reader that same experience that she was getting, where I'm asking myself questions and going like, man, what is behind all of this? And where's the motivations for these things? And from a Gothic element, right? We'll get to Silo in a second, but just from that Gothic element, it had vibes. I guess maybe Pennsylvania, the rural Pennsylvania setting, sort of reminded me of a lot of the Gothic horror fiction that I enjoyed. That was set in New England and kind of that gaslight vibe, that Victorian era vibe. Um, Even though this is modern, but because of how rural that setting is, it has those elements, and I was connecting to that. And I think too that part of well, I'm going to ask you how much of like cryptids, because I was reading this and I'm like, oh, that's totally another Gothic thing, right? Like folkloric monsters and creatures, mythical creatures of folklore, how much, because I was starting to see connections. I don't know if that was me, you know, reading between the lines or if it was intended and how much of it was intended, because the cryptid stuff is certainly on the fantasy side, right? So
Mhm.
you kind of wove that in. How much of that influenced the development of the plot with Agnes and Silo versus a juxtaposition with science? Because I also was getting a little Frankenstein, right? Because that's,
Oh,
I mean,
oh yeah.
what she is, it is both fantasy and science. She's breeding, she's using science to breed a exceptionally large crow, which becomes almost mythical, right? So how did that interplay come about? Like, how did you find the balance? Um,
I started at science,
okay,
and then I
because she's a
started with
scientist, right? Like, I mean, that's in character, but she's also a woman who grew up in an area full of superstitions and cryptids and, um, Bigfoot sightings. So, you know,
Absolutely. So there's this in fiction we talk about like people who write outlines and they're planners and they know how that they make storyboards and they know how their book is going to go before they write it. And
yes.
then there are called pantsers who follow what the page is doing.
Yeah.
And I am pantser all the way. There's nothing about me that is and so I'm writing and my own father laughs when I say, and then Agnes did this. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, I'm writing it, and then she does this thing, and then I have to deal with it. And he's like, you wrote it. And that's not how I feel about it. So at a certain point, when I'm writing about this, the creation of Solo, Solo becomes related to the crows that are around the house. There is a relationship there. And I didn't know that at the beginning of my novel at all. And so then I had to deal with that and do the research about myth. And then I had to do research on behavior of crows because it had to also be a behavior that everybody has seen. So
Yes.
that it's grounded in behavior that you would understand and then goes further. And that's the fantasy. Somebody told me, and I'm really grateful that the other genre that I participate in is weird lit, which is, that's everything in the kitchen sink.
Right.
And to treat it as it's absolutely serious and it belongs together and it's fine. And
Yeah.
I would agree. So.
Um, so I had a question about, and you've kind of touched on it, about how much research you had to do. How did you approach that research? Because I felt like I was gaining points in like Corvid lore as I as I read this book. How like how much research did you have to do with that stuff? And then also, how did you approach that research? Was it like I'm going to tackle it, all and get it all, or was it kind of as needed?
It was definitely as needed, but I don't think you could write a book about a large corvid unless you had already a sort of a passion for, I already knew crazy things off the internet about what they were capable of and specifically their intelligence. Um, so I came in being fascinated because of that or with that background. And then the more I did, the more I looked into it, the more fascinating it was. Eventually, I actually bought two or three books, which I didn't read from front to back, but
Right.
definitely paged through. But that didn't come until further in, where I was just like, I'm going to take a break from writing for a minute and I'm going to read and feed my brain and then come back to it and see if any of that is useful. So it wasn't super specific, like I need to know this thing. Although sometimes it is. And I always say, I don't think that I would have been a novelist before the internet because much as I love going to the library, I'm not that methodical, right? So if I can have an idea and then immediately get the information I need, that's really helpful to me. And I did that a number of times. And I'm like, is this realistic? Would this feeding? How do birds feed? And
Right.
how do corvids feed? And so I had to go, you cannot, birds don't like to have you watch them feed. So they're not as much on video as you would think they are, which that was a fascinating thing for me to learn that
Yeah.
lots of raptors do not want to feed in front of anyone. They go to their own secretive place and do this. Like fascinating stuff.
It's interesting. So, I mean, you touched on the fact that you're not, a planner as much as a pantser, because another one of my questions had to do with, in terms of the process, how much of what you conceptualized initially manifested because you consciously planned it, or structured it, versus things which came about, you know, less planned or kind of more organically as needed. And you kind of touched on that a little bit, but I also, I mean, and that relates to the Corvid research, but I guess also like I found like some of the other elements that related to where she was, the kinds of communities that are there. And you touched a little bit on the, the generational trauma, anything related to First Nations peoples. Like how much of that did you need to do research on? And also like was that as needed? Was it something foundational or that you started in the early kind of ideation process?
No.
Okay,
So I did want I wanted very much to set it in place. So it's where I grew up, but it's not where I've lived recently.
sure.
So I went uh I took a couple of visits and I went to it's a passion of mine to go to little museums and I'd never actually visited the Ephrata Cloisters, which is it's a place where you can see this early religion sect and how they lived, 300 years ago in central Pennsylvania. And in that museum that they have, there were a ton of old pamphlets, reprinted pamphlets from that time. And I grabbed every for free. A lot of them are 30 cents, it was like crazy. And I just grabbed a ton of them. And at that moment, I knew that they had to live in the book. And I didn't know exactly how, but I mean, that information started becoming part of the basis of Agnes's mother's character. She knows this. She has some of this history. She has some, and for whatever reason, her own interests are wacky. She's a wacky, undiagnosed person who had a deep need to understand sort of what had happened on the land that she grew up on. And and she was not very good at communicating her obsessions or passions to her daughters, and she left them early. And so this is when Agnes discovers, oh, there are reasons that my mother was the way that she was, or there are struggles and traumas that she was dealing with that I had no idea about.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And
Yeah.
so she
And
was the historian in the book. She was the one that you get that from.
there is a big contrast between Agnes and her sister.
Mm.
What do they represent? All right. I'm reading into this, but I got a little bit of the prodigal son vibe from this, right? Like I got a little bit of, I mean, I guess both of them they went their separate ways and they're different people, right? At the most basic level, but is there deeper meaning in terms of their sisterhood and in terms of their identities and their choices for who they became as adult women?
Absolutely. They I don't think that you could call their childhood particularly happy, and they
Right.
both veered away from the basic their family structure. It's it's not a spoiler to say Agnes went to science, and they weren't raised in. It's a very religious area, but they weren't raised in a religious household. And Bethany, her sister, turns to religion, a very specific kind of religion. It's sort of you don't know exactly what it is, but it's evangelical, probably charismatic in some sense. And that's one choice they make. But you're absolutely right. In the prodigal son, Agnes splits and Bethany lives with her dad for a decade after that. So there is that she is sort of staying in the area, in the place, dealing with all of the um, the aftermath of their childhood in that place. And so I knew that they were going to be different, but what do they represent? Much, much later, after the book was written, I actually recognized on a big thematically, there's an urban-rural divide that they represent as well that did not come to me because Agnes takes
Really?
herself off, gets educated, goes to Philadelphia, which is this huge city not far from where they grew up. And I mean, I also lived in Philadelphia. I lived in Baltimore. I don't like so I was writing from my life in a way. And then I'm like, oh, but in our country right now, this is a divide that I've represented in a way that was not conscious, but is obvious to anybody who's reading it, I think. So,
I mean, I was picking up on little parts of it. I wasn't sure, but I was picking up on little parts. I mean, from not just the fact that she had, gone to college and lived in the city, but like down to like what car she drove versus her sister's truck, like that kind of stuff.
mhm.
And
Oh yeah.
and um her, her frustrations with being back home and the house being a wreck and it's, falling apart and there's like that she's the older sibling that now has to come and clean up all the crap that her hoarder parents left. And, there's like this resentment in there too. I just think that the relationship between the sisters was really powerful too. And so to that end, um, let's go back to the bird. So Solo, I mean, again, I kept seeing Solo as a Corvid Frankenstein, right? Like, good intention, right? Her intention was to create this beautiful mythical creature that could fly her daughter around and give her absolute freedom. But how does this turn dark and gothic? Because, and without spoiling things, I'm going to leave that to you. But as the book goes on, Solo becomes he almost goes from like a surrogate child to, the Frankenstein's monster kind of situation. How does that evolve and without spoiling things, where is it going ultimately?
So that actually that I followed Solo through the behavioral research that I did. So when things start going bad, basically at the very beginning of the book, Solo has not flown, right? So that's we met when we meet Solo. Solo has not flown, so he's within the barn and controlled in that way.
Right.
Um,
Like a lab.
and
I mean, the barn is
yeah,
basically her laboratory.
absolutely. When he gets out of the barn, then he starts behaving in ways. And I think that as a reader, like they had to be consistent with behaviors of real crows in some sense to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't believe what I was writing. But then there is this idea that he's been bred, he's incredibly smart, which we can see. Corvids are smart. Are they as smart as Solo? I'm not sure. And with that intelligence and everything that she's done, is there malevolence? And is Solo going to act in a way that is like Frankenstein, visits vengeance, or has misguided acts of protection? I mean, like um, but I do think what was lovely about writing about an animal is there is always the question about intent. And I don't think it's really, you cannot know the mind of a corvid
Right.
because those aren't our minds.
Yeah.
So that attribution of where, how much actual evil or darkness is there versus a tiger. I can't imagine, why did the leopard eat my face?
Yeah.
Like
Right.
you raised a crow the size of a horse.
Yeah.
It's not gonna, it's not a puppy. And
Right.
so, yeah. But I loved that tension. I grew up watching The Wild World of Animals.
Yeah.
And as a lot of people our age did, you come home from school and you watch these scenes of absolute brutality,
Yeah.
and that was normal fare for us. I don't think it's as normal anymore for like my students when
Yeah.
I mentioned this and they were horrified. They're
Right.
like, they watch animal shows, but it wasn't like, I'm like, no, every day,
Yeah.
see a gazelle taken down.
Well, and I mean, we have real life stories in our era of people who are, experts with wild animals and then they get their arm ripped off or they get killed. I mean, there was a movie about the guy who was friends with the
Steve
bears.
Irwin.
Yeah,
Oh no, the bears. I was thinking Steve Irwin died from a stingray,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Easy.
So I think another thing that I found kind of captivating, I in my mind was making a lot of comparisons between Agnes and Solo and Daenerys Stormborn and her dragons because it's like she's mothering, she's basically, this is a surrogate child, and she sees a future with this creation, doing mythical great things, but also it's a wild creature as much as it might have been developed in her, barn laboratory. It, and what do wild creatures do when they are of an exceptional size? And is that just nature? Is it? So I kept seeing parallels between that as well, Frankenstein, the kind of Game of Thrones things, but all of that ties in these elements of fantasy and gothic and horror. I think a bunch of themes were present for me as a reader. I think one thing was, certainly man versus nature. There was man versus man with her kind of internal existential crisis, her marriage, her relationships with her family, her relationship, with her daughter, her sister, reconciling past versus the present. All of these themes were really powerfully interwoven, and I think it's certainly people who like all of those kind of vibes and genres and themes are going to be rewarded with this, because I think you went really deep with this and wove a lot of really cool elements into it. I think what one of the questions that I wanted to ask kind of goes more back to behind the scenes and your process. And I always like to ask authors, for real talk about like what the challenges and obstacles were, what problems cropped up during the process.
This is a problem that happens for pantsers, right? You're following something. You can follow it down a rabbit hole or down a dark alley that doesn't work. And that happened a couple times. And then you take a minute, you read, and you're like, that was a wrong turn. And I think it's happened to me enough. This is my second published novel. That I actually had a third that I completed, and which is epically long, and I actually was picked up for publication, and which is another problem with writing. And then the press folded. So I love that book, and I still have hopes for it. But so this is my third novel. So I have gone, and I know how I write. So I've gone down those paths. The first time it happens, you feel like you've wasted time and energy, and then you're also like, how can I retract and go another way? How is this
Right.
possible? And uh, one of the things I say to my students is like, this is why the computer, you don't know what it's like not to have a computer, but I remember writing by hand. I'm like, I can save that. There are probably things in that chapter that I will use later in this story or another one. And I can just start a new file. And at this point, the first couple times it happens, you're panicked. You're like, that was a wasted, now it's almost like I tried that, didn't work. I'm gonna go a different way. And you learn something every single time. You learn like what made that the wrong alley will help make the next one not the wrong alley. Because you're like, oh, this is not. One of the things that I knew, I'm not a planner, but at a certain point, I knew that I needed Agnes to be interacting with another human. And I was like, so then I'm like, I need somebody to show up here. You mentioned that I was a dancer, I was a choreographer. I need more bodies in the room. That is
Yeah.
absolutely required. And then I have to figure out how to make that happen. Um, so there are a lot of issues in writing the way I write. There's a lot of issues. I'm a poet, so I write in short bursts. So my scenes are short. And that works for me.
You know what? It works for
Yeah.
me too, because I'm a slow reader. So I like short chapters because it
Yep.
and so as you just to rewind 1 second,
Yep.
almost as advice, in the same fashion for your students, when you stall out, when you hit a point where either you wrote something and you're recognizing that it's not going to work, or you hit a point where you're like, crap, I don't know where to go next. How do you work through those hills? How do you get over those humps and press on? What are some of your approaches?
So you mentioned me having a lot of tools that I'm using in the book. Uh, my three novels all did that and I said I'm always working on poetry and fiction. So for me, I have many threads in the book. And so if Agnes is dead in the water, then I'm like, what about her mom's story? What's going on with her mom's story? What is going on with her husband who doesn't have he's the poet, and so the poetry is his in the book. Um, and so sometimes I just put my mind there. But the wonderful thing about doing that and having these different approaches and different ways in is that you're still thinking about the book. So it's slam a door, will a window open? Like you're like, I know that I can't be here, but I'm going to be in the room. I'm going to think about the book and I'm going to spend my time in the world. And your subconscious is working on the parts that you're like not looking at right now. So, and that's also true just to take a break. Like
Right.
there are times when you just like you go take a hike. Outside is great for me. As a writer, I'm like if you don't have a walking practice, I don't know. Like you need to be outside where there is a lot of input and it's not your screen. And it's really, really helpful. So and being outside helped me with the bleak gothic experience too, especially in the
Yeah.
winter.
Well, I was going to ask, when you went back to Pennsylvania and kind of had a chance to visit that region, how much of nature and the outdoors, were you kind of capturing in order to use as fuel and inspiration in the descriptive language, for when Agnes is back home?
So much.
I mean,
I
did
mean,
you did you take photos? Like, I know you took and you actually integrated some of those elements from the historical pamphlets like
Mhm.
into the book, which is
Yeah,
really cool because it's, you made that part of her mother's research,
yeah.
and integrated some of that. But, in terms of how you capture those influences as an author, were you writing notes? Were you taking pictures? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, I take pictures. I take pictures a lot. And so I wrote this book. I'm not you're a slow reader, I'm a slow writer. Partly because I have a whole life outside of here's something. Most writers do not do it for their job. Most. Most of them have some other influ I mean, like it the percentage is like winning the lottery. If you're a
Yeah,
best-selling author who doesn't have to do anything else, that's, 0.2% of all authors in the world.
right.
And not your favorite. A lot of your favorite authors will not be those people. So I write slow because I have this other work going on, this other life. And so I have pictures over years. And as soon as I realized I was writing about corvids, oh my gosh, the number of pictures I have of crows specifically. And some really beautiful ones. I'm actually thinking about getting a couple of them framed because then you get sort of get obsessed with where you see them and what they're doing. But absolutely, the South Central Pennsylvania is beautiful and bucolic and these rolling hills and a lot of farmland. And then when I was doing the research, it was a forest. It was a rainforest, a particular type of with all these chestnut trees. And you can still find little dense, and I became obsessed with that, like the hollers where there's like this dense woody forest, like almost fairyland, and it's
Yeah.
not far, but it's so small. you
Yeah.
know. And yeah, no, I rediscovered a lot of the beauty of the area, but it has its hidden. You kept saying Northeast. To me it reminded me of the descriptions of the moors in England that are the other Gothic side of the tradition.
Oh,
Because all the grasslands and the swamps and
yeah.
the yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like these ponds and this farmland and then the grasses that grow around them and where people rewild their farm, the fallow.
Yeah.
Gorgeous stuff, but also a little scary.
Yeah. Well, I think there are elements that are recognizable in the settings. Um, Obviously for people who maybe came from those kind of areas, but I think even, city and suburban, urban kind of folk can pick up on those things from other, literature. And to me, there's a little bit of a timelessness about it, even though it's set in our modern world. It's like when she goes back there, you're going back in time in some fashions. It's there are little whether it's kind of the folklore vibes or um, maybe the elements of when people live in small communities, word travels fast, that kind of stuff, gossip, whatever it is. I feel in some ways like her sister Bethany is a lifeline to that community because Agnes is so withdrawn for most of the story. She's in her own world. Um, so in terms of another element of process, because I like to talk about collaboration, you how did as you finished the book and you're getting ready to publish, how did you collaborate with the artists to come up with the cover? And I think a lot of my viewers appreciate good art, whether that's in novels or in role playing game books. How did that collaboration work? How did you find the artist? How did that collaboration work?
I do have a bunch of poetry books, and it was a different process. For my poetry books, actually, they're tiny presses, and they often ask you to go find the people,
Yeah,
right? For this process, University of Massachusetts Press had a designer for their book. They asked for my input, and I was so happy that they took it because I said, there's this crow and there's many ways to go in this, and I'm drawn to illustrative or non photographic, like because it's not a real, this is fantastical, and I am drawn to that. And then I specifically said that I was drawn to Japanese watercolor. So the image in the front is an excerpt from a 200 plus year old image that's in the public domain. It's a Japanese watercolor, and they actually flip the orientation, which which I love because then I know nothing about graphic design, but it flying down the way you read left to right
yeah,
feels it has more energy than the original, where it's flying sort of backwards across. Anybody who reads English are reading
right.
eye. And so it reverses. And this has so much more momentum because they reversed it that way.
It's a little bit scary
Yeah.
because it looks like he's like a raptor flying down for the kill. So it kind of subtly hints at that vibe. And it reinforces my dragon theory because it is huge and it looks like a dragon that's coming in for the kill.
And again, with the graphic art, like there in the original image, it's an entire crow, but then by cutting it off, so it fills more than the frame,
Yeah,
that gives the sense of size. And I
yeah.
was wondering how you could do that, right? Because this is not bigger than an actual crow, but that choice. And again, I'm always just in awe of the people who are able to do this work. So
Yeah.
I was so grateful when they revealed the cover to me, and there was some discussion before. They're like, "Well, we're going back and forth, but we want to get it right before we send it on to you." So I'm all nervous, and then when it came through, I'm like, "Yes!" So
So
happy.
here's a hypothetical because I like weird, springboard questions. But, you mentioned that you had a chapter in life where you were working with people who were writing, but from a different perspective for game development, that kind of stuff, animation.
Mhm.
If this book were to be adapted and turned into a graphic novel,
Mhm.
and you had some say in the art direction, what kind of style do you think you would suggest that they use?
I
I
I
mean, do
have
you?
opinions
Yeah. I
about
mean, but you
things.
the source image for this being from, Japanese watercolor, like, is that something, would you see this entirely being produced as a black and white graphic novel, for example? Like having a monochrome style with watercolor, like would you carry on that vibe to
Absolutely.
visualize the story you told?
Absolutely. Actually, like even more sepia, like the scene from Schindler's List. So it's not actually just black and white. It's sepia tone with important moments of color. And I don't even have to think about that twice. There are scenes where color is very important to me. And so this book is sepia, and then
Yeah,
there's blue because there's this whole thing that her mother has with indigo ink, that you find out. So
right.
there's blue, and then there's obviously blood. And
Yeah,
so those are the book already has a color scheme.
yeah.
And yes, if I talked to an artist who wanted to, we would talk about that and how that works. Yeah.
It's funny that so I we didn't talk about this before, everybody who's watching. This is I do my interviews no prep. So I but it's interesting that you brought up that color palette, your inspiration palette, because as there was kind of a sepia tone vibe in my visualizations when she was in the house, when she was cleaning out the attic, when she was in the barn. I felt that, and I kind of mentioned it, it almost felt like going back in time. It had a very sepia vibe. I imagine the farm was not a colorful, happy place. It was run down. It was, in desperate need of repair, even to the point where I imagine, the appliances, the old appliances being way older than they should have been, that kind of stuff. Um, and of course, I mean, Solo is a Corvid, right? So monochrome kind of, black and white sort of things. If you see it, something dark flying in the night sky, it's sort of mysterious because it's dark and there's not a lot of contrast between a dark thing flying in the night sky and the night sky. Unless it passes in front of the moon, then you see this terrible, silhouette that's maybe, terrifying because of its size. But I think there's one other element too that I wanted to kind of touch on. The this kind of mixes a bunch of genres. Is this for future projects? Is this kind of a territory that you would explore, either in novel form or in poetry?
The my first novel was maybe what some people call magical realism, or that's a disputed term, speculative in a particular way.
Yeah,
It's sort of our world, but it has an art form that doesn't exist. And then my second novel that hasn't been published was pretty classic sci-fi in further future and technology that is that but this crossover of things that can't happen, but also trying to ground these things that can't happen in a very real space. I actually think that that is going to be a problem for some people because you're like, oh, this is a person who has, real psychological problems that I can identify, but this is this crazy mad scientist horror thing, and I'm not sure how they work together. I love that. I'm like, that's when things happen, when you put together things that you don't expect to work together. And you see what happens. I mean, that's alchemy, right? And yeah, so I'm in love with that process. That was it created sparks when you're writing. You don't know what's going to happen. And like being surprised by the process of writing is the joy. It's very much the joy for me.
As an author, this being your second published book, what is what is something that you felt in terms of the rewards of completing this project, the rewards of having it be published from that perspective, from the perspective of an author, to be able to have that physical book? What is that feeling? What is that reward? And how does that maybe fuel you to continue working on other projects?
It's an amazing thing to hold the book in your hand. I mean, it was amazing when my first poem got published in a journal, and I held the journal. I was actually in Chicago at the time, and I went to all these bookstores when they used to carry poetry journals, and I went looking for it. It was the Indiana Review. I can tell you what it was, and to have it in my hand and say, "There's my name," like it's I say this to my students too. I'm like, it's not wrong to take pleasure from external validation.
Right,
It it's I don't think you can survive as a writer if that's the only thing you take pleasure from. Like it
right.
just that's not a sustainable thing. But I have learned now to take absolute joy in the physical object, to feel like it's a real thing out in the world. And then there's also like a separation. Like now that it is here, right? It's not mine. That's
Yeah,
a crazy thing. Like somebody reads it and they're gonna have their all their stuff about it, and they don't usually get to talk to me.
right.
So I don't usually get to defend it or tell them what I think they should be getting out of it or any of that. And to relinquish that, it's this is the in between. You have it in your hand, it's great, and then you send it out, and it is I'm trying to really enjoy. The book comes out on March 3rd, and I'm trying to enjoy, that month where it's this brand new thing that I'm introducing, because after that, it's everybody's.
Yeah,
Hopefully, it's everybody's. Everybody should have one.
yeah. So let me ask you this question. Is there something specific about the book that we didn't touch on that you feel like maybe people should know?
I do think that there's stuff about animals in the book that was interesting to me. We didn't talk about it, but in South Central Pennsylvania, and for those people who are less familiar, we are talking about the area of the country where Amish and Mennonite communities still. So this walking back in time is accompanied by not just the sepia tone of everything, but buggies on the side of the road and horse-drawn, and people who choose not to use a lot of modern technology. And that is definitely part of the landscape. It's also a place where there's a lot of dog breeding on the farms, and there's some about in the book of that. And it's also a place where there's poultry processing. And if you don't know what poultry processing is, and both of those make brief um, moments in the book, but they're important to me because I don't believe in cruelty to animals. This is a total fictional thing, but actually, as I was doing research, I recognized that there is some cruelty to animals in this area as well, and that actually it sort of helped me balance out this idea of maybe having an evil crow. I'm like, but I also like I want you to know, like I I think that how we treat each other and how we treat animals are not a dissimilar vibe. Um, and so that actually everything in the kitchen sink made it into this book in some ways. But like I said, I don't think I could write a novel that didn't want to bring like my whole self to and my whole experience of where I grew up. And that's part of it, good and bad.
As you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the advice that we all hear is write what you know, but we can also incorporate so much about other people who we've met in our lives or who've, inspired us or places that we've been that we don't necessarily know, that we didn't necessarily grow up in, but had some impact, made some impact or connection. So I think you wove a lot of these things, your personal things, the influences and interests in an incredibly complex tapestry. And yet it was so easy to read. And I'm saying that as the classic slow reader. I got so deep into it. And I think any book that makes you pause, pause your reading and start asking yourself questions, trying to figure things out is a good read. So I really appreciate it. I think that, I think a lot of my audience, who appreciates fantasy horror, uh, I think they're going to love this book. So again, Kirsten, thanks for coming on and doing this on this episode of Behind the Book and for sharing your insights, especially from the perspective of an author and a writer, because I think that's one of the central reasons why I do this series is to get those perspectives and to share those with the audience because I think there are a lot of people out there who are writing and who maybe don't they feel isolated or they don't know what the process is like for other writers. So thank you for being open and sharing those insights.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Bill.
Well, this has been another episode. And again, thanks to my guest, Kirsten Kaschock. And this book, An Impossibility of Crows, is definitely one that you need to go get, read, and then we'll discuss more. So thanks again for coming on the show, Kirsten.